You're listening to Soundside. I'm Gabriel Spitzer in for Libby Dankman. The day that 65-year-old Julie Leon died was the hottest day ever recorded in Washington state history. Her death was officially ruled as hyperthermia, or overheating. Officially, more than 100 people died in the state due to that extreme 2021 heat wave, but many experts believe the number of deaths exceeds 400. Last week, Julie's daughter, Misti Leon, filed a lawsuit pointing the finger at who she thinks is responsible: Big Oil. The lawsuit claims that oil and gas companies have been knowingly misleading the public for more than 50 years about the effects of fossil fuels on the climate. It says this deception has made them trillions of dollars while leading to the deaths of people like Julie Leon. Corey Silverman-Roati is a senior fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, and he joins us now to talk this case over. Hey, thanks for speaking with us, Corey.
Thanks for having me.
So this lawsuit seems to be the first of its kind. What is the argument that it makes?
Yeah, so basically, this lawsuit is against fossil fuel companies, and it alleges that these fossil fuel companies knew for decades that their products were dangerous. They marketed these products to the public anyway, and marketed them as safe, and they obscured their knowledge about the dangerousness of their products. As a result of them marketing these products and people using them, our climate system has changed and grown warmer and more erratic. The climate change story you hear. And as a result of that, we have individual extreme weather events like this heat dome that have occurred that have led to people's deaths, like the death that happened in this case from overheating. And the allegation is that because of that causal chain of events, the fossil fuel companies are responsible for this wrongful death.
In the past, the companies and some scientists have argued that it's difficult, if not impossible, to tie climate change to a specific weather event, just that climate change will make that kind of weather event more common. Does that pose a problem for this lawsuit, showing a direct causal link?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge, but something we've seen in the climate space is that over the last few decades, scientists have become much more confident in their ability to tie individual weather events to climate change. So 20 years ago, scientists, I think, could not tell you that an individual hurricane or a heat wave or a heat dome like this event were a result of climate change. But more recently, the scientific tools, the modeling has become more advanced in a way that scientists can more confidently say that but for climate change, this would not have happened. So with this individual heat wave, scientists can confidently say that without climate change caused by the emissions of fossil fuels predominantly, this event would not have happened.
Hmm. Well, we've seen a handful of lawsuits in recent years that try and do something similar in one way or another, hold oil and gas companies accountable, whether they were filed by a group of young people or by cities and states. How does this suit differ from those other lawsuits, or how is it similar?
Yeah, so we've seen a wave of litigation against fossil fuel companies all over the country starting in about 2017. And the vast majority of these cases have been on behalf of local governments or city governments or state governments against the fossil fuel companies, saying we have to spend X amount, X million dollars in response to the harms that are a result of your company's behavior. Those suits have been, tied up in courts over a bunch of procedural objections that the fossil fuel companies have made. And they've gone sort of up and down between federal and state courts as a result of that fight. This case is different. It's unique because it's on behalf of an individual and it makes this wrongful death claim. So it's a different type of claim rather than we have to spend this much more money to deal with all the climate harms. This case is saying my family member died as a result of this company behavior, and you
Hmm.
should have to pay because of that behavior.
I'm curious whether those other lawsuits have showed us anything about what the company's playbook is for these kinds of legal actions.
So these plaintiffs are going up against these multi-billion dollar multinational companies with immense resources, and they're able to fight these cases in court every way possible. So they bring procedural objections that A, this isn't the right venue, that B, these questions shouldn't be heard by courts at all. They should be in the executive or legislative branches, or C, these claims just aren't available within this specific legal system that you're filing within. So they've, been able to litigate every single aspect of these claims and then up and down different levels of courts. So between trial courts, appellate courts, and up to the Supreme Court in some cases. So I think the playbook that we see is that these companies will do everything within their means in order to get these cases dismissed.
Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of the snags of some of these other previous attempts to sue the oil companies and the oil and gas companies have fallen short on procedural hurdles. Has the actual legal argument really been tested? Do we have a sense of how it might hold up?
A few of the cases have been dismissed, but a number and even the majority of the cases are still ongoing within state courts throughout the country. And some of those cases, like in Hawaii, a case that was brought by Honolulu, that case has seen some initial of these like bigger procedural questions have gone up to the state Supreme Court. And in that case, the state Supreme Court dismissed the fossil fuel company's objections to this case moving forward. So that case is closer to this sort of trial phase of these lawsuits. But all that being said, we haven't seen a trial go forward in these cases yet. And that's where we would really get all of the evidence presented around these causation questions of like what responsibility these companies have for the result of their products, and also what is the evidence for climate change and what is the evidence for their decades of behavior around how dangerous their products are.
Yeah. We're seeing more and more deaths and casualties from these heat waves as the Earth continues to warm up. Last year, more than 2,000 people just in the U.S. died from heat-related causes. So if a lawsuit like this one, this wrongful death suit, were successful, what would happen? I mean, would this open the floodgates for wrongful death suits from all over the place?
Yeah, I think that's maybe one reason why you see this effort by the fossil fuel companies to get these cases dismissed as quickly as they can. So this individual case, if the plaintiff were successful, wouldn't necessarily result in a major damages monetary award against the companies. But if other plaintiffs see that this plaintiff is successful, you could envision many more suits going forward as a result of all of these deaths that are occurring as a result of climate change. That being said, it's a long road between now and this or any of these cases being successful. So I think we have a number of legal questions that need to be answered before we get to that.
Does that mean we probably wouldn't see a verdict in this suit for a while?
Yeah, I think you would at least need to see a number of years to see all of these legal questions litigated and debated before we would see a result.
I wonder if the companies make the argument that they're being unfairly singled out. Like this lawsuit doesn't name coal companies or agriculture or other big contributors to climate change, but it does name these oil and gas companies.
Yeah, I think that's certainly something that the companies will argue. And that's a piece of this puzzle, right? Because what the plaintiffs are alleging is that you companies are responsible for X% of this climate problem. They're not alleging that they are solely responsible for the entire problem of climate change. That being said, I think the what the plaintiffs will respond with is this isn't just about contributions to climate change, it's also about knowledge of climate change harms and what these companies did to either tell the public about what those harms would be or obscure their knowledge of what those harms would be. So that sort of question around fraudulent company behavior is a key piece. And what the plaintiffs will look to in the past is past examples in tobacco and opioid litigation around what the companies knew and when they knew it and what they did on behalf of that information.
Oh, say more, because those seem like analogous examples where you've got this gigantic systemic problem, and then you've got some major actors who might have some responsibility for it. And so the question is, how do you hold those people responsible? So what do we learn from those opioid and big tobacco lawsuits?
Yeah, so in the tobacco case, we saw multiple waves of litigation around plaintiffs who, dealt with cancer or other effects of tobacco use, bringing cases against tobacco companies, alleging that their behavior and their fraudulent misrepresentation of the harmful effects of their products resulted in harms to humans. So yeah, we saw a number of waves of litigation, a number of ways in which the companies were able to have the cases dismissed before we settled on this one successful wave where governments sued the tobacco companies on behalf of all of the healthcare expenses that they had incurred as a result of all the health harms that people dealt with as a result of tobacco use. And that resulted in a, multi-million, multi-billion dollar payout to these governments in order to deal with these effects. And since then, we've seen some similar to this case, wrongful death suits filed against the companies on behalf of individuals that died as a result of their tobacco use.
Interesting. And so with the climate cases, we're seeing them trying out different plaintiffs trying out different legal theories in order to hold the companies responsible, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's sort of a way of seeing what the legal system will uphold in terms of these claims based on these plaintiffs' evidence that they're presenting around the decades of fossil fuel company misrepresentation of the harms of their products.
Right, right. Well, people might remember several lawsuits that were filed by young people, young climate activists who argued that the government was harming them by allowing climate change to proceed more or less unchecked. There was just a new one that was filed last week out of Montana. So a lot of those cases have been dismissed, but what have we learned from those suits about, the challenges to holding these institutions accountable?
So I think what we can do here is we can distinguish between two types of cases within this broader wave of litigation. One is suits against governments, like we saw in Montana, where they were successfully able to hold the government accountable for failing to adequately respond to climate change. And then the other, like this case and this wave of litigation, is suits against fossil fuel companies, where they are suing the companies for their alleged misrepresentations. So there's sort of different claims involved, different challenges. But I think we can expect to see both types of claims going forward with more frequency as climate harms continue.
Well, turning back to this Washington case, the Julie Leon case, suing where her daughter is suing for wrongful death, um, how do you kind of handicap the chances of success? How strong is the legal argument for a wrongful death lawsuit here?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say at this point because it is such a unique case, and it's sort of the first one to allege this wrongful death type claim. I think this case has a unique challenge in that, in addition to tying the fossil fuel companies' behavior to climate change and what the effects of that were, they have this additional question of was this individual death a result of the heat wave? And was that heat wave a result of climate change? So there's sort of an additional causal step that this plaintiff is going to have to prove. Just because it's unique and it's different doesn't mean that it's impossible for this plaintiff to succeed. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the courts grapple with these questions and grapple with the evidence that might be presented.
So the plaintiffs in this case requested a jury trial. That means they're going to have to sort of make their case to ordinary citizens. And this is such a, in some ways, technically complex question when you're dealing with the science of climate change. And it's also a highly polarized political question, right? Does that suggest that this might be a more difficult case to prove to a jury?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and one of the challenges of us not seeing a trial in any of these fossil fuel companies' cases so far is not being able to have that evidence really be tested at trial, to where we can really have this filter between what is good science in the climate space and what is junk science. And I think a trial can really have that clarifying effect to where, in order for scientists to be able to present their evidence well, it has to be backed up by legitimate climate science. And I think it can be really clarifying for a jury and for the general public to have that filter of what is good information and what is bad information that a trial can provide.
Yeah. And what difference, if any, do you think it makes to have an individual at the center of this case who can kind of be the face of it? There are literally, pictures of her. We can get to know her a little bit and so on. Does that matter?
Yeah, I don't know that it matters legally, but it certainly matters in terms of how folks might think about this question. And what I'm thinking about here is a lot of times people can think, oh, climate change is this far off in the future thing that maybe it'll affect my grandkids. Whereas this case is putting it front and center in the present, in the recent past, saying this individual person died from a heat wave. That heat wave was caused by climate change. And look, these companies are the people that are the institutions that are responsible for this death. So it has a really concrete, specific way of clarifying in people's minds of what the consequences of climate change are.
Corey Silverman Roati is a senior fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Corey.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.